Shabbat Shalom. In this week's Parsha, Parshat Devarim, we start the 5th book of the Torah. Devarim has a very special status, and in particular Parashat Devarim, for it is always the Shabbat prior to Tisha B'Av. It has a special name. We call it Shabbat Chazon, based on the first word of the prophet Isaiah's Haftorah, Chazon Yishayahu. And the entire focus of this Shabbat, the Torah reading, is starting to get us into the mood of Tisha B'Av. So what is it within the Parasha that lends us to think about Tisha B'Av, and what message is there for us to take? When we open the book of Devarim, we start off by Moses telling us that there were multiple places where the Jewish people sinned. Golden calf, Korach, the manna, etc. But what really takes a major portion of the parasha is the story of the sin of the spies. How the people approach Moses and says, please send spies to look at the land. How the spies come back with their negative reports, and of course the people cry. God then decrees that for the next 40 years they will remain in the desert until that generation dies, and then a new generation will rise and enter the land of Israel. Our rabbis tell us something fascinating, that Moses' spiritual characteristic was something called netzach, eternity. Whatever Moses did lasted forever. When he took us out of Egypt, that lasted forever. When he gave us the Torah at Har Sinai, that lasted forever. So had Moses brought us into the land of Israel, that would have lasted forever. History would have finished. Moses would have led us into the land, the temple would have been rebuilt, and heaven would have come onto earth. The Garden of Eden would have been restored, with God walking with humanity. But that was not to be. For that fateful night, when the Jewish people spurned the land, cried that night about not wanting to go to the land of Israel, at that moment, the history was changed irreparably. Moses would never lead the Jewish people into the land of Israel. We would enter, but we'd lose the temple, be exiled, go back, be exiled again, and finally come back in our own generation. So the path of Jewish history was changed because of events of that night when the people cried. And thus, our Parsha might be hinting to us about this valuable lesson, about the importance of human actions. That actions have consequences. Some consequences are minor. Some of them have reverberations throughout history. Tisha B'Av is the time in which we explore and read about the destruction of the temple. We read about the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, how Jeremiah reads and tells us about what he witnessed. We'll study the Talmud and to look at the stories about the destruction of temple number 2. We'll sit down on the floor and read about the Kinot and read about the subsequent tragedies. But they all go back to that fateful night. Because once the Jewish people spurned the land of Israel, turned their backs against it, and the decree was issued, a new path opened for them. One of the things that I've noticed is that we pride ourselves in our generation about the power of the individual. And many of us think to ourselves that what I do for myself should have no impact on what happens to anybody else. One thing that we have noticed, especially with this coronavirus, is that when one person doesn't do the right thing, it impacts on the entire community. We are currently here in Sydney in a lockdown because of one person. One person can really turn things on its head, and the repercussions can reverberate. When we read the Parsha of Devarim and we read the story of the spies, we see for ourselves directly what happens when the decisions are made, and the repercussions that are created from it. And then we sit down with Tisha B'Av, and all we read is about what happened because of that moment. So Parashat Devarim always falls before Tisha B'Av, because built within the text is an understanding that all the Tisha B'Avs were based upon that fateful night. Much to think about. Shabbat Shalom. And may the Nachama, may the comfort come to us, that we absorb the lessons, learn from them, and grow and become better people. Shabbat Shalom.